doesn't take away the pain. It just gives everything a purpose. And I have found, contrasting these two things, going through basically the same situation with and without it, it just makes it more bearable and keeps hope alive where it wouldn't. But it did not fix all of my problems. It simply gave me the capacity to continue to work at them. And that has been what has been the biggest benefit that I have gotten towards looking at my life like story.
Welcome to the Masterful Man podcast. I'm your host, Sven Masterson, coach, mentor, author, and fellow traveler on the path to mastery. Every man reaches a point where he knows he can't keep living the way he has been. The question is, what comes next? Here, you'll hear from men who've made the shift, men who've gone from stuck to unstuck, unshakable, and unstoppable. If you're ready to start moving forward, you're in the right place. In today's episode, I'm joined by Cliff, a writer, thinker, and man who knows the weight of words. We're talking about the stories we tell ourselves, not the ones we put on paper, but the ones that quietly run our lives, the ones that justify our stuckness, explain our avoidance, and help us feel just right enough to avoid changing. What if the story you're in isn't true? What if it's not even yours? This conversation isn't about fiction. It's about meaning, distortion, and the courage it takes to stop narrating and start living. If you've ever felt trapped inside your own interpretation of life, this one's for you. Let's get into it. Hey, Cliff. Thank you for being my guest today on the Masterful Man podcast. I appreciate you being here. Before we jump into today's topic, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, where you are, what you do. Be as specific as you like, but also don't say anything you wouldn't want on the front page of the New York Times.
Certainly. So I am a 49 years old, live in Eastern Pennsylvania, been here ever since I graduated college. And I am a writer by trade. I write technical documentation for a software company that does business facilitation software. So I like to think of my job as something like a translator. I take highly technical involved information and present it in ways that someone who might not have finished their GED can understand. And I spend a lot of my time outside of work also writing. I've been very interested in writing and storytelling for most of my life. And I'm actually gearing up for my very first book release. So I'm about to transition into being an actual officially published novelist. So story is something I live and breathe.
Terrific. So yeah, that's a great segue into today's topic. And I think this will be fun because we're both authors, and I write nonfiction for my audience about the kind of issues we talk about in these podcasts. But you write both fiction and then also like business nonfiction. Technical writing. So there's all kinds of different facets of writing that we'll be able to talk about. And I'm going to defer to you a lot because I would not consider myself much of a writer because writing is more of a tool for like my coaching and mentoring. Whereas you, I think you're much more of a craftsman about writing than I am. Yeah. Today's episode is really about talking about the role of understanding story and how we can use story as a tool of sorts to understand our own personal development journey. Maybe you'd probably have a more eloquent way of saying it, but what made you want to come on the podcast and talk about story? Let's start there.
So as part of our journey towards development, we have talked a lot about story, the power of story. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that we are the author of our own life. And that can mean a lot of different things. But one of the things that really struck me as I thought about that is thinking of my life as a story. It has a lot of multi-layered potential to it if you can really embrace it, I think. For starters, I think that by looking at your own life as an actual story, there can be a lot of power in that, in preventing yourself from slipping into passivity and a victim mentality. Because if you are consciously thinking about the story of your life and you are the protagonist, if not the hero, then is it going to be a story worth reading or worth engaging in
Right.
if you're just sitting around getting kicked around? Those stories exist, right? They're tragedies. Nobody wants to live a tragedy. Their power is in their catharsis, and thank God that's not me.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to say that the benefit to us with tragedies is that we use them as contrast? So you mentioned catharsis, but I kind of treat tragedies like warnings.
Yes, that's the word
Like,
I was going to
hey,
go for.
like if you don't choose the heroic, your life story will be a tragedy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you can go all the way back to Greek antiquity with that. The Greek tragedy had a particular formula to it, and that formula always involved the actual term is the tragic hero, though he's not a hero, always has a fatal flaw that he remains blind to. And in many cases, it's actually pointed out to him by the chorus. The chorus is this small group of people who represent wisdom, and they come to our tragic hero and try to get him to see his tragic flaw. And part of the flaw is his blindness to it, be it obstinance, pride, whatever. And that flaw leads to that horrible outcome. And yeah,
Can
it's a
you
warning.
just realizing our listeners may be all over the place as far as their life experience, their education, they're familiar with Greek literature, and I myself confessedly, if that's even a word, I don't have a lot of meaningful education in this space. So I'm wondering, just to make it really relatable for most listeners, can you think of a movie or a story that's really well known that demonstrates this kind of this tragedy concept, or a figure who fits this mold?
Probably one of the most famous Greek tragedies is one I would guess most people would be well acquainted with, is Oedipus, the man who murdered his father, so took his mother as his own wife, and then when he found out what he had done, stabbed his own eyes out. Um, the, those are the big pieces of the story that most people are familiar with. But when you read the actual play, he is warned along the way to heed certain things that he, in his pride, refuses to. And
What about
if he had simply swallowed his pride a little bit and given other people credence that they might know something he doesn't, that entire thing could have been averted.
okay? Can you think of any modern stories that have emerged maybe in the last 100 years or so that people might know that demonstrates this pattern?
As tragedies, my favorite tragedy in modern cinema, I'm trying to think if there's a heroic or a fatal flaw in it, but I absolutely love the film A Simple Plan. Um, and for those who haven't seen it, first of all, see it. It's fantastic. But it's Bill Pullman plays just an everyman in a small town somewhere up north. And he and his brother, who's mildly developmentally challenged, say he's functioning on the level of Forrest Gump. He and his brother, when they're out in the woods, they find a downed private jet. And it turns out to be a flight that was almost certainly ferrying drug money, because they find duffel bags of cash. And so the simple plan is that they just take it and they sit on it and they don't say anything, and they don't spend it, and they wait a year, because at that point, anyone who's looking for it will have given up on it, and then they can start. But if they start doing it now, then there's heat and it's going to come back to them. And it's as simple a plan as possible. And the flaw isn't in our main character. It's in everybody else he talks to. He seems to be the only one who can keep his mouth shut and not spend any money. His brother, who is a sweet, lovable guy, but is a little simple and very influenceable, if that's a word, and who has a rock stupid and just bad friend, it starts causing trouble. And everything that they do is just one simple fix, one more thing, until, suddenly they're having to kill people, and it's spiraling out of control. But it all starts from just, if you can all just keep your mouth shut and sit on this like it didn't happen, we're good. And they can't. and they don't.
I love that you brought this up, actually. And, for anybody listening, this is a non-scripted conversation where we're talking about a topic. And what I hear you actually describing from my lens as a author and men's coach is actually what happens when a man is trying to control life and outcomes. There's like a sequence of, I just need to control this one more thing. And then that attempt to control something creates a new thing. And now he's got to control that. And you're actually interestingly describing what I would say is the pattern of the ego. Because if you're trying to live a life where things outside of you need to change for your story to improve, I would say, first of all, you are living in a tragedy. But secondly, it creates this cascade. And so a lot of times in calls with men, when I'm trying to explain this, and this won't be new to you, but maybe to our listener, I refer to Anakin Skywalker because he has that dream where Padme dies in childbirth, and he takes a series of steps to try to avoid that actually take him to, you're more of a Star Wars fan than I am. It's Mustafar, right? He ends up on that flaming planet. He gets dismembered. She dies. And the whole thing comes about because of this pattern of trying to live in the fearful future and prevent it from happening. Is it fair to say that meets the picture of a tragedy? Like, is that what's going on?
That's almost, in a lot of tragedies, that is the very structure. The very actions taken in order to try to prevent a particular outcome wind up being the very catalyst that brings it about.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you have the tragedy, and I love this. I love the contrast idea here too, because in our community we kind of talk about two paths, and it's an attempt to really help people understand that moment by moment, you're always at a decision point. You're always at a fork in the road where you can either choose the heroic path, interestingly, in this conversation, or the tragedy path. One of them leaves you feeling like a victim of some kind, and one of them will be uncomfortable. There'll be struggle and adversity because you have to come to a place of understanding you don't control the future, but will generally lead you down the heroic path.
So I'm actually really glad that you brought that part up too, because I had for a long time labored under this misconception that if I was struggling, then there was something that I was doing wrong. But again, bringing it back to the structure of story, the heroic path is not easy and it's not comfortable. Having a life of comfort is not living a story.
Yeah.
When I write fiction, I am the god of my world. I am a cruel, ugly god. Put my characters through horrible, horrible things. And my wife at the time, at one point, asked me, "Is like, why can't you just write a story in which people are happy?" And I said, because that might be what you want in life. But if I wrote a 20-page story about some guy sitting in a lounge chair next to his pool in his $20 million mansion as surgically augmented women just splash around in the water, and that's all that happened, you wouldn't finish it because it's boring.
Yeah.
That's not what a story is. A story has to involve conflict and struggle.
Let's get a little tangential about this, because you piqued my curiosity with that statement, because I believe in the modern world, if you look at what marketing is and social media, it sure as hell seems like they're actually saying that should be the goal, right? Just think of, for example, Instagram and TikTok and influencers, and how many people are doing exactly that, right? You have these people splashing around in some exotic location with exotic looking forever young people who have like impossible, not really impossible physique, but just this kind of like ideal, imagined utopia. But I mean, you just, whether you did it accidentally or not, you just described that setting. And yet it seems like people are just longing for this, which is a bit paradoxical. Like, we don't watch movies that are just about, once upon a time and then they lived happily ever after. Like, we just don't go to those kinds of films, buy those kinds of books, read the kind of stories you talk about. Why are we so fascinated with this in things like social media? What's that about?
So we do like happily ever after, though, right? Like, that is, generally speaking, stories that end well for our characters are the most satisfying. Occasionally, we will want to see a tragedy, but I don't think that there's many people who are going to say that that is their real, like, bread and butter of media consumption. I just want to see someone fail and suffer endlessly in iteration after iteration. I just want to see
Right.
absolute lack of accomplishment and success. We want to see the struggle, but then we want to see them win. So,
Well, it
but the
seems like, let me interrupt you here a second. What I'm saying is, it seems like, in my observation of how I watch other people consume media and the media I see presented to us, it seems like there's only the win. It seems like what has been kind of just like avoided is the struggle.
so
I don't know.
I would argue that's because social media has this veneer of realness to it, right? Like if that were just a movie, the movie would probably bomb. But because this is what your life could be, I think most people would prefer not to go through pain and suffering and everything in order to get to the happy ending. They want
Yeah.
the happy ending for themselves. We want to see our characters achieve the happy ending. We would like to just arrive there minus all of the grief and suffering and pain.
Yeah. That's the mystery to me. And maybe maybe you could introduce us in a moment to the idea of the 3 act structure and whatnot. But in my realm, realizing I'm not the author you are, as far as I don't write stories, I write nonfiction. But one of the things that's occurred to me in my years as a coach and mentor is that human transformation has what I would call a tripartite structure. There are 3 phases of human transformation. There's some sort of bondage, and a transformational or liminal space, and then there's freedom. And that we keep reliving this cycle of going from bondage through transformation to freedom. But yet I find when I engage a person who's suffering, they want to take that liminal second part out. They want a bipartite structure. They want to live in a story where they're suffering and they go right to freedom. And it's interesting, since I have recognized the difference between tripartite and bipartite. And I know that's kind of technical, but it's just a way to describe it. 2 parts or 3 parts. I've noticed just how much messaging in the world tries to sell people on a concept of basically a 2-part path that removes this middle part. But what I've come to love about this idea of story, and we can kind of weave this in, is that's where the good stuff happens, right? Like Rocky just didn't go from a guy who wanted to fight to just like kicking ass. Like, we see his transformation. And so in every story I like, at least, there's always the transformation of the main character. And it happens in this liminal space. Maybe you can relate this back to a story structure in more, proper terms. But
Sure. First, I'll say I understand the appeal of the two-part system because our basic human psychology is based on two things: avoiding pain, which is the primary, and seeking pleasure. And if given a choice, we will avoid pain over seeking pleasure. So if we're trying to get out of pain, being sold an idea of, well, sure, I can do that for you through this alternately painful path that will eventually bring you, as opposed to, and while that is really the only way, and that is the healthy way, but somebody else can say, well, no, but you can just buy this thing and I'll just jump you right to the end. Like that's what we
yeah,
really, however, yeah, the 3 act structure,
well, let me
there's
let me
a,
interject before you get into this description. I want to just share a little bit of authentically raw and real feedback on that. One of my biggest challenges as a coach and mentor is that it's very hard to get the attention of today's audience because everybody's looking for that like the 2-part story. And so most marketing is oriented towards basically a quick instant fix. And so it seems like it's challenging for me because when you have a message that's like, hey, plan to spend the next 6 to 12 months transforming in a meaningful way, and then you have these other people that are like, 12 days to get her back or 21 days to, such and such. I think it's bullshit personally, but at the same time, people will engage with those ideas much easier. And so one of the challenges is just trying to find the person who even understands that there's 3 stages and knows that they need to go through that second stage. Because, what we do in Masterful Men is generally, I would say, to help men navigate across that second stage, to go from, across the desert between the bondage and the freedom. And it doesn't seem like a very popular thing that people are out there looking for, because they're oftentimes stuck in this belief that they can go right to the end without the transformational step, right?
I tend to agree, but at the same time, I also think that deep down, there's at least some segment of the population that knows they can't. So I have a bunch of examples bubbling in my head right now, but so an easy one, since we're talking about social media, is physique. You had talked about these people have, godlike physiques. They look like carved statues come to life and all that. It's true. There's also, though, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of fakery about that you can get pec implants, you can get ab implants now. There's something called synth oil, which is something that you can pump into your muscles that make them bigger, but it just increases the volume. It's not the actual muscle structure itself. And then, of course, there's steroids. But at the end of the day, everybody knows
eating
or
because
not
you're
eating if you want to get
stoned
skinny.
out of your mind all the time. Yeah.
Right. But I think at the end of the day, anyone who's looking for a physique, they will still know deep down inside it's not real. And I think there's a lot of people who do know that. They might not want to do the arduous physical work over a long period of time to develop the thing that they think they want. But if they cheat, they'll also know they cheated. So I think there is a certain segment of the population that understands that path is the only way to go. And I think it is because we instinctually do understand story. And there is no story that has endured through the ages that doesn't have that middle component.
Right. Yeah, that's the point.
Right. I just think, I know from my own personal experience, when I was at the beginning of that and I was in a tremendous amount of pain, all I wanted was to not be in pain anymore. And so I was in a vulnerable state, and I could have been sold anything that promised me to get me out of there.
Yeah.
In a more rational setting inside my own head, I would have been much more inclined to undertake that arduous path, because I understand its fundamental value.
I wonder how much of this is age and maturity. And I'm saying that as there's a good bit of my life. I'm 50 years old now, but for the first about 40 years, I would say I was also stuck in that immaturity, and I was looking to I wouldn't have known this consciously, but I was looking for reward without effort, at least in my relationship. And gets nuanced to talk about, because I am not a lazy person. I was willing to put in the hard work in almost every area of life. Like, I'm a homesteader. I make my own power. I grow my own food. I've been self-employed for most of my adult life, at least half of it. We make our own educational system for our children. We do a lot of stuff, right? But it had escaped me in my own inner life that pattern, that I was not living in that pattern. I was living in a two-part story inside, which interestingly made me headed down a tragedy path for a while.
Was that belief because of the stories that you had heard about what relationships were supposed to be like, though?
I do think that's true. I have some philosophical, kind of perspectives about this too. One of which is, we are very far removed from the natural world. And for example, if you want a tomato sandwich today, you can just get in a car that you didn't build, fill it with fuel that you didn't, distill, or you get my meaning. You could drive to the store, you can purchase a tomato, and you really have no idea how all those things came to pass. So when I started homesteading, I started to see the cause and effect of life a lot more clearly. I started to see, how much effort it takes to grow like a spotless, really nice looking and tasting piece of produce. There's a lot of effort involved. And I started to become really aware in my own self how much I saw myself as entitled to abundance without putting in the effort that would lead to it. Because we kind of live in this weird time where we have a lot of abundance available to us that we have no part in producing. So yeah, it was about making power, keeping animals alive. Like there's a joke in Homesteaders that some people say like a goat is born and then starts looking for a place to die. So like I had animals dying all the time, at fruit trees, not doing well. And I started to become frustrated because I moved in here with this mindset. It's like Instagram, right? I'm going to just pour money and intention into something and then boom, harvest. And it was not like that at all. And that allowed me to start seeing, you know what? This is exactly what I've done in my relationship. I showed up, but I didn't really cultivate. And this might ding a few bells for you because you've been through like my course about cultivating the romance that we want. It came from those times because I was living in a story where like you have what you want, you just throw a bunch of time and money at it, and then it works, right? Which is actually a boring story, by the way. So yeah, it led me, and I also spent a lot of time, I think, trying to avoid outcomes I didn't want. That's another aspect of that story that sucked. And then something that hopefully we could talk about in this conversation. I was focused on the plot line of someone else's story. So maybe we could circle back to that in a minute. But
Sure.
yeah.
But yeah, I definitely wanted to touch on something that you had talked about, is that you went in with a certain set of expectations, both to homesteading and your relationship, because of the stories that you had heard. And this is like a personal soapbox of mine. I have a lot to say about popular media these days, not just because of the quality of storytelling or, whether I happen to pretty much detest most things that hit the big screen these days because I don't think it's good. It's to me, it's more important than that. One of the things that I learned as I was studying this is that our brains are wired for story. In fact, I learned that from a book by the same name, Wired for Story. We absorb information better when it is presented to us in narrative form than if we just get raw data. Similarly, our retention of that information is better and our comprehension is increased. We can just get raw data, but we have been wired over time, over generations of our species, to give and receive information predominantly in narrative format. One of the things that apparently separated us from the Neanderthals was our ability to mythologize. We started to teach cultural lessons through our myths, which are stories. This means that the stories that we take in shape our worldview, whether we are aware of it or not. And so this is, for example, my huge problem with romantic comedies. I used to date a girl who loved them, and I was admittedly kind of intolerant and prickly, but I mean, I would start to rail about them in the middle of it. And she's like, "What is your problem? It's just a fun movie." I was like, "No, this is establishing a certain expectation. The man is supposed to change himself in order to go from who he is at his core to something that is attractive to a woman and then is rewarded for it. This is crap.
Yeah,
This
I
is
would say
horrible."
we share some similar viewpoints. I would say a vast majority of the media in the West right now is indoctrination to be codependent.
Yeah.
Exactly this. And, I have 6 kids. 3 of them are daughters. 3 of them are sons. My sons all are grown and out of the home, but my daughters are all home. And my girls say all the time, "Dad, you've just ruined movies for us," because they all understand healthy relationships. They understand the idea of their inner life is theirs, and they're all quite mature. But even my 12-year-old, she's actually the best at it among them, or the most vocal about it. We'll be watching a movie, like family movie night is every Friday, right? And we have pizza and watch a movie or something. She'll eye roll. She'll be like, "That's so codependent." And it's usually some sort of, oftentimes it's either like sometimes a kid's movie, but sometimes it's just, like a rom-com or like a family level rom-com. And what's funny is I don't walk around talking about codependency. I have helped them navigate their inner life and understand dependency just as a part, like, hey, like to tone their emotions and what they're feeling without any apology, but also understand like, hey, you don't have to wait for your sister or a friend to change for you to have a new reality. I've taught them this concept of you're the author of this. And that's been really freeing. Like I said, they're all mature, they're all well regulated for themselves, but they also feel like, can't we just enjoy a movie without, without this? And there's not a lot. So this leads to a lot of really interesting dinner conversations for us. And music too, in our age group, you and I would say the vast majority of music sung by men is some sort of I'm incomplete without a female. I can't stand losing you, for example, right? You remember the Police? I've been
Yes.
hearing that stuff since I was at least 5 years old. I've been hearing about how my life is incomplete. My story is incomplete without a certain, interestingly, um, supporting character.
Yes. Yes. So that's the power of the story, right? Like, you don't have to be consciously aware of any of this for it to begin to install a certain set of beliefs. There's actually a fairly high degree of responsibility we all have to take for ourselves in order, in order to police what kind of media we routinely take in. It might seem like, oh, it's just an innocent movie. Okay, great. Yeah. And I'm not here to say that like we're all just one film away from being propagandized into a particular
Right.
mindset. But like you said, I grew up in the same period of time you did. 80s and 80s music was all about how men should lay down their lives for their idea of love. And for me anyway, the alternative scene was, Stabbing Westward and Nine Inch Nails was all about men ready to just end their lives because a woman had left them. It was kind of two sides of the same coin. The man cannot function without the woman. And no surprise, I had horrible times with breakups. They were catastrophic events for me. It wasn't just sad. It was world ending. And I didn't understand what was going on for a very long time, but I had a certain system of beliefs because of the stories that were being sung to me and a lot of the other media that I had taken in. It's the power of story. And so if we begin to take control of that ourselves and really, pen our own story, it's not a fix for everything. That was one of the things that I struggled with. Is like, all right, if I'm going to look at this like a story, well, then now my life's going to turn around. No, I mean, yes, but not like that. And any story worth a damn has that struggle in it anyway. So it's not like it's
You're
just
right.
an instant fix for getting you out of pain. It provides perspective, but not
Right.
immediate relief. I don't think that there's anything that is actually true that can provide that immediate relief. But like you were saying,
Yeah, I don't.
every hero story has the main part of it. The middle part is where they're not okay. And then they get to a point where they've emerged, they've grown to a place where they're fine.
Yeah, this is really, really useful on a lot of levels. I've shared the same experience. I would call that, just for people who are thinking about what we're saying, our worldview. Every human has a worldview, and your worldview is basically your collection of stories for how you interpret your experience. And we take them for granted. They're formulated really without our consent, mostly as small children. And they bear fruit. And really, there's no man that comes our way who generally does not have some form of a wounded lover thing going on, right? Some of them are on the toxic side of that. Like, the way they express it is not healthy. They're more angry. The people in their life might be more prone to call them a narcissist. They might be fastidious or controlling. Then the other side is the nice guys. They're like, impish, and they would be like the guys who grew up saying, it's always the bad guys that get the girls. And yeah, they just feel like nice guys, right? So, but all of that, you can kind of see how that comes from worldview that they grew up around. And I was one too. It took me a long time to understand that my worldview is kind of the problem. And we don't fix worldviews overnight because they're stories, and we build our worldview for decades. So to try to really examine your own worldview is very difficult. And this is another reason I believe you must have a community of people to do it with, because otherwise your own biases make you like you can't see your own story objectively. See what I mean? Because it's the only story you've ever known. Anyway, where was I going with that? I have found it really useful to understand this story concept, the tragedy, but also the hero's journey. became aware of the hero's journey, I felt like somebody had given me the Rosetta Stone for understanding some things about my own journey. And it helped me to start saying, wait a minute, why am I trying to get out of like the plot? Would I want to watch the movie version of my own life if I actually got what I wanted, which would be like the struggle free, easy, you go out and you throw a bunch of seed in the ground on the homestead and boom, you know, like abundant, extravagant harvest. Is that actually a good story? No, it's actually not.
No, and you'll notice that most stories end with the happy ending. It doesn't continue on after that. You don't spend another, 2 hours or 400 pages with them living that happy ending that they achieved at the end of the book. They get to that point, and then we walk away because that's where our interest ends.
Until we want a sequel.
In which case something goes wrong again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Just like
the
life.
story is the struggle, right? And so, you talked about hero's journey, but you had previously asked about 3-act structure, and there are
Yeah.
two different ways of breaking it down. But let's start with 3-act because it's smaller.
Assume our listener doesn't know any of this stuff. So tell us what you mean by 3-act structure and
So
whatnot.
yeah, almost every story that is going to feel satisfying has a particular structure to it. Now, people play with it a little bit, but you will feel it inherently if it violates that too egregiously. It just doesn't sit well with us. Just like our brains are wired for story, they're wired for a certain kind of story, and it follows a particular template of sorts of how the action goes. And so a 3-act structure is one of the ways to understand that. And to really oversimplify it, the 3 acts are the beginning, the middle, and the end. But there are particular points that occur within each of those that we need to see. So in the 3-act structure, you begin with, in Act 1, you begin with establishment. This is the character, this is the life they're in at the beginning of the story. Here's where we are before something happens, just to get a baseline. It tends to be pretty quick. In a movie, this is your establishment shot. You might see your protagonist come home from work and get introduced to his family or something, just so you kind of know who he is. Then you have what's called the inciting incident. That's where something happens where that status quo that we've just been introduced to gets disrupted. Maybe he comes home and he finds that his wife is in bed with somebody else, and suddenly, that whole domestic life that we've just been shown is blown up.
This is like Luke Skywalker coming back from talking to Obi-Wan and finding his aunt and uncle murdered and the moisture farm destroyed, right?
Almost.
Okay.
Actually, that's one step further. So this would be him finding the recording in R2-D2 of Leia asking for help. Suddenly his life has been disrupted. So now he's going to do something out of character. He's not just going to sit around the moisture farm bitching about how boring it is anymore. Now he's going to go do something different. He's going to go visit the old crazy hermit out in the desert.
Okay. I'm glad
That's
I asked
the
that
inciting
question.
incident. At this point, though, he's been called to action. He could say no. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But it's what you're talking about is the next point, which is called the gateway into Act 2. This is something that happens that absolutely slams the door behind him. There is no going back to the world that we just knew. The only way forward now is into the unknown and into the rest of the story. That's where he comes home from visiting Ben and finds that his aunt and uncle have been killed by the Empire and his home has been burned to the ground.
Let me see if I understand this by relating this back to the work we do in Masterful Men and that I help men with. What I think I hear you saying is that's when a man talks to his wife or his partner and she says, I want space, or I love you, but I'm not in love with you, or I think we should separate. I want a divorce. Or maybe he finds out, he sees a message on her phone that he really didn't want to see. He'd kind of been trying to, tell himself something else was going on. Would you say that's a gateway to Act 2? Is that what we're talking about? Like when that happens, where now you have some event happen that you just can't unsee or unexperience?
There's no just going back to what it was, right? Like maybe you could save the relationship, but you now need to do a whole lot of work in order to get back to whatever. And it's not going to be like it used to be. it's going to be different. So yes, some
Yeah.
event that just seals the past life you've had off completely. There is no turning around anymore.
Okay. Yeah. So this is actually really lining up pretty nicely then, as far as the three acts, and that I would call what we do traversing a man from that, through Act Two and into Act Three. Yeah, keep going. Tell us more about what happens in Act Two.
All right, so Act Two, this is the meat of the story. Generally speaking, your Act One is just going to be roughly 10 to 20 pages. The majority of the book is going to be Act Two. This is where ideally the transformation happens. This is all of the struggle. There's a lot of plot points along Act Two. Most of them, can be, I've seen them called fun and games. They're just constantly there are constant tests along the way where somebody is presented with a particular challenge out in this new environment, and they either meet it or they fail to meet it. There are two different ways that this can go. Either in the first half of Act Two, they do really well, which means usually at some point they then hit a turnaround and they start to get beat up by circumstances, or they constantly find themselves not quite up to the challenge. And by the time they hit what's called the midpoint, which is literally the middle of Act Two, that's where you have a reversal. So if they've failed to meet the challenges up until this point, at the midpoint is where they sort of have a light bulb moment, and all of that failure has now culminated in enough hard-earned wisdom that they can then begin to turn it around. And then as the challenges continue to come, now they are meeting them. Or they've had it kind of easy up until this point, and that light bulb moment is, this is different from what I thought it was. And now I understand what's really happening. Or, the villain, shows his true power or something like that. And then our hero is now kind of on his heels for a while. Either way, like I said, you go up to this midpoint, you have a reversal. It is revelatory in either way. And then the stakes continue to rise until you hit something called, you have what's called the false defeat or the false victory. Again, depending upon how things are going. But this is where, our hero is now coming up to the culmination of all of this. They're going to fight the big battle. They have all of the wisdom they need. They have the resources they need. They have a plan. They're going for it. And they go after the big bad, and they fail. And it goes horribly. This is called the black moment. Everything bottoms out. And I don't mean like, that he retreats to lick his wounds. Like, every resource he had has been destroyed. Every ally he had has either abandoned him or has been killed. He is left without resource, without hope. And you could just roll the credits here and you have a tragedy. However, this is also...
Is it fair to say this is like what's building the dramatic tension of the plot? Like, it's putting the audience or the reader in a place of just complete uncertainty and maybe even a little bit of despair.
Ideally, all of those trials throughout Act Two should have been doing that. This is the edge of the seat moment where, like, oh my God, they didn't.
Yeah.
You were shown that this is how it's going to go, and then all of a sudden it got yanked away, and I was like, what could he possibly do now?
Would this be like Neo dying in the Matrix version 1?
This would be Neo dying yeah. I mean, it's really fast in that particular case, but okay. Yes, that's a good example. They don't keep you in suspense for very long.
Yeah, right.
Oh, he's only dead for a couple seconds, but yeah, it didn't work out, right? Like, Neo was running around, he was beating the hell out of things. He was the one, right? He had just beaten Smith. Everything was going well. He goes through that door and he takes 3 in the chest, and then a whole lot more. I think the agent empties the clip into him after that, and he flatlines. Magazines. So yes, that wasn't the way it was supposed to go. So that's the black moment. But in a heroic tale, that's actually where they lick their wounds. They somehow draw upon all of the resources and lessons that they've learned throughout all of Act Two. We thought they had done it before. Now they're really doing it. And they come back, and it's round 2. And this time they succeed. And then from that point forward, we have the denouement, which is, they go home and it's kind of happily ever after. If it's Tolkien, you'll get like 6 chapters after that. But generally speaking, it's, our hero kisses the girl and, fade to black over a sunset. And, everything else is just sort of left to our imagination.
Okay.
So that's
Interesting.
that's the structure. And like you said, you can find it in a lot of very popular films. The Matrix is one. The one that gets pulled apart in every book on this is, in fact, Star Wars. And they'll do it, film by film, as well as the original trilogy they will put on this entire spectrum. So
Interesting.
it's the most enduring stories are the ones that do, in fact, follow this. Being templated doesn't mean that they're cookie cutter. There's a tremendous amount of, ingenuity and imagination in them, but they follow a structure that just works with our psyche. We want this. And if we don't see the struggle, we don't tend to like it. There's a lot of
Yeah.
films these days. You talk about how, modern cinema is just kind of, look at how many people don't actually earn anything in modern cinema. They start off great and they end awesome. And they never really fail along the way. And people walk out saying like, the special effects were awesome, but there was just something. I don't hear people talking about those films the way that they
Yeah.
still talk about Star Wars from the 70s.
I agree. I mean, like you said, I think there's something instinctive in us that recognizes that's really not a representation of our life. And it's unsatisfying. And maybe we could kind of tie this back to like, the role it plays in your own life. This is going back some ways, but the first place I ever heard of this concept of tying my life back to a story was actually John Eldridge. I don't know if you know who John Eldridge is, but John wrote a famous book called Wild at Heart. He's a Christian author. And I was at a conference of his one time, and he started talking a lot about story, and it was actually really helpful. But I also didn't have the maturity to quite let it sink in. But he talked about this idea of like understanding the value of seeing your life as unfolding in the same way of these stories that we like. And if you wouldn't like a movie like this, would you want your life to be different? Right. And so the seeds for me were planted in that. But I'm curious because this was your idea to talk about this, how has this shown up for you as an author of both fiction and nonfiction and as a writer? How have these concepts helped you to understand your own story as a human?
This was actually a question that I struggled with quite a bit. I understood story as a concept. I knew how to write them. And I even got the idea of how my own life and experience could be seen as a narrative, because at the end of the day, even fiction is really about the real world, because it's ultimately all about the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I struggled with how to take that from the conceptual and find some sort of useful application in my life. And I can give you 2 examples now. One is really small, and it's just a way to get the feeling of what it could offer. And it's not entirely a story, but it's hints at it, which is if you put on the right soundtrack during a workout, at least I do. If I'm a little low energy or something like that, there are times when I really want to just push it. If I can picture my training session as like a bit of a montage from a movie, like the Rocky film or something like that, it changes the way it all feels and gives me some extra juice that wouldn't be there. And it's a really simple explanation, but it shows you, just that shift. There's nothing different. I'm not doing different exercises. I'm not changing the weight or anything like that, but I'm just looking at it a little bit differently and giving it just like a dramatic tint to it. And there's something about that just gives me something more. But
Yeah, me too. In fact, it's been a couple of years now, but my trainer at the time asked me to do some testing, like with music, without music, and I tried a bunch of different kinds of music, and it totally changed my workout performance, and I could see it in my workout data and my HRV, and I started to build at that time my music playlist to specifically provoke not just style of music, but lyrically things that appealed to what I would call like the warrior in King, Warrior, Magician, Lover terms, like that, but also lover that invoked passion and purpose, but specifically that deliberate effort in the direction of purpose. And I would say, yeah, that's the same exact idea of like, I like seeing what I was doing in the gym as having like serving the plot, like the so what, like why. And I think this is a great question for men. Like, why do you want to be fit? Because if you can't answer the why of fitness, if it's actually to delay death, I would suggest you're dangerously close to living in a tragedy, because you're you're not actually serving a life-giving plot by doing that, right? Hey, this is Sven. I hope you're enjoying today's episode of the Masterful Man podcast. We're taking a quick break, and in the meantime, I've got a question for you. Are you feeling stuck? Not just tired, but like something in you is quietly fading? Like the tools that used to work, grit, performance, logic, aren't cutting it anymore? If that hits home, I wrote something for you. It's called The First Steps Out of Stuck, a straight-talking guide for men ready to reclaim their power in life, love, and leadership. And you can grab it free right now at guides.masterful.men. Again, that's guides.masterful.men. Let this be the moment you stop waiting and start creating. Now let's get back to today's conversation.
So it's funny you say life-giving, because the other example I had was a whole lot less fun. 2 years ago now, I used to have a dog named Balder. Balder was, I'm still in touch with his breeder, and she used to say all the time, it really seems like the two of you were literally made for one another. I mean, I was a boy and his dog, and he was just the most awesome thing ever. But Bal's time came. And he died an old man. It wasn't tragic, but it was back in 2023. He came to an end. And life after that took a real turn. It was just a few months after he passed away, I lost my father. Then I lost 2 friends. Then I lost my engagement. And it was just, then my mother began to slide into dementia. And it was just one thing after another. And I really struggled with the cumulative effect of that, to the point where I had to be hospitalized because I was going to end my own life. I knew exactly how and when and all of it. I had all the details worked out. And when I woke up and knew all of that, I said, I'm in some real danger now. This isn't, I'm sad. This is, I have a plan. I know exactly how to do it. And I now know that I can. My survival instinct is now dead to the point where there is nothing holding me back from doing this, except that I know I shouldn't. So I went and got some help. But it was really easy because I had no hope. Because the story that I was telling myself at the time was that I was living a life in which it was just one tragic storm after another. And history was telling me that this isn't going to stop, that there's going to be more things, that I'm going to suffer more loss, more grief, and I cannot handle anymore. But there was a morning just a couple of months ago where I was thinking about Balder. I was actually looking at a picture of him. And I thought about the story where his name came from. Balder is named after a mythological figure, the first son of Odin. And the story of Balder the Aesir, the warrior god, was that when he was born, his mother went to all of creation and secured a vow from them that they would never harm her son. And so Balder, through love, was rendered invulnerable. And though he was the most beneficent of the Aesir, he was still an Aesir, meaning that he was a warrior god of the Vikings. And so he was a big, tough warrior, but love was his defining quality. And this is why I wanted that name for my dog. And he lived up to it. He was big and tough and everything, but he was a sweetheart. There was a practice that the other Aesir would have in Valhalla as they ate. They'd line up and they'd throw weapons at Balder and just watch everything bounce off of him because he was invulnerable to everything, except that when his mother secured this vow, creation was not complete. And so mistletoe had not actually come into being yet. So she never secured that vow. Loki, the trickster god, found out about this. And he crafted a spear with a hardened mistletoe head and put it in the hands of Höder, who was a blind god. And Höder threw it at Balder to play the game. and it pierced his heart, and he died. And so his mother was grief-stricken, went to Niflheim, the land of the dead, and spoke to Hel, the warden, and asked her to release her son. And she agreed if everything in creation would shed a tear for him. And so she went to all of creation and asked everything to shed a tear for her son. And everything agreed, except for Loki. And so Balder remained dead. Except that that's not where the story ends. Balder's death was the first portent of Ragnarok. And most people know Ragnarok as the Nordic version of the Christian apocalypse. And there are similarities. There's a great battle, a conflagration consumes the world, and the forces of good and evil fight. In Ragnarok, they destroy each other. The Aesir are killed to a man, but they destroy all of the Jotun, the giants and the monsters. However, that is the end of that cycle. The world is left to the Vanir, who are the gentler gods of the Vikings, the ones who don't have anything to do with battle. They are love and fertility and the sun and all of that. The Vanir are what are left, and they take the gentlest of humanity who also survive, and they craft a new world in which there is no need for warriors because there are no more monsters. And it's a golden age. And so where the story I had been telling myself was that Balder was the first tragedy of an endless chain that was going to plague me through the rest of my life, I could instead say Balder was the portent of my 3 winters of Ragnarok, of a horrible time where I would face tremendous difficulty, fight, suffer more death, but at the end of it, the world that I knew was not going to survive, but I was going to be left with something else, and there would be a bounty there. I just needed to fight my way to it. And that didn't make everything go away, but it recontextualized everything to give the struggle that I had some meaning. It wasn't just, well, I just have to stick it out because people say I have to. There was some happy ending out there waiting for me. I had to fight my way to it, but it was out there. And that restored some hope. And that was enough. It didn't make me feel great, but it did take me away from suicidal ideation. And it was all about, it didn't change all of the loss I suffered, but it provided a different meaning.
I'm going to push back a little bit to just adjust the language there. It wasn't out there, it was in there.
Yes.
Like all of that was inside of you. And you just demonstrated something very powerful, a very Viktor Frankl idea, by the way, which was your circumstances didn't change and they didn't need to change. What changed was the way that you were willing to see them and the meaning that you were willing to give them. This is a huge concept in Masterful Men, and some people hate it because they're living in this realm of being where the outside world is dictating their story. And they haven't come to understand just how powerless that is, because if the plot of your story is shaped by circumstances, you have no choice as a human but to be reactive. And that's not actually a path to an empowered existence. It's not a good story because you're plotless, right? But what I love about what you just described is you just told us how you used your power as a meaning maker to draw upon resources that you already had. Like you had all this Viking knowledge that I mean, I would need a whiteboard and all that spelled out to just follow what you just said. It's not known to me, right? But I have my own collection of resources to draw from, like maybe movies or stories that I've read, songs that inspire me, concepts. But what you just showed us is how you were willing to see your own story, that it was following a plot that was going somewhere. And that the moment you injected meaning and purpose into it, interestingly and beautifully by, seeing or reframing Balder's role in your story, right? It took you out of darkness and despair with no circumstance change.
No circumstance change.
And I think that's the point of probably why you want to have this call is that, this is how you flourish as a human being. It's not by changing your circumstances. That is a neurotic race to the bottom to believe that you need to get your circumstances to change. That's actually the recipe for living in a tragedy. This is what I think I've heard you say in this call, right? Is trying to get your circumstances to change. But what actually turned your story from a tragedy to a hero's journey is simply your willingness to see it differently.
And because I was looking at it through the lens of a heroic tale. I mean, this one was called the Poetic Edda. There was no expectation that if I do this, I'm going to get that Instagram photo. I'm still in for struggle and strife and all of
Yeah.
that, but it does take me somewhere. I'm not just here to endure it.
You just mentioned two things that I think are really important in the conversation, but also in understanding how maturity works. There's two aspects. One is you have to make peace that there's going to be a desert to cross, that there's struggle and adversity. But the other is you have to know where that's going, meaning you have to have your eyes set on the place or the experience or the meaning or the purpose that sits on the other side of all that challenge and adversity. And so if you're living in a place of what is the point, which is common these days, and purposelessness, it's going to be very hard to do that. And I would tie this back to the conversation about self-worth that's really prominent in our community, which is, we live in this weird time because we live in this time where a lot of Western worldviews have told us you don't have a purpose. This is all accidental and happenstance. And, no worldview is without its consequences. So if you walk around in a worldview where humans have no purpose, I just want to tie all this together. You lose the capacity to make meaning meaningful because a person will think, well, there is no end to the story in which something is good. But look at human history. We have always told stories with this 3-act structure, with the hero's journey or the monomyth. We're always telling stories in which the story is going somewhere. So if you tell a culture your story isn't going anywhere, what do you think you're going to see? And are we seeing that culturally? Because we see increases in rates of suicide, despair, all these things. And I think it's for a number of reasons, but I think it starts with, in part, that we have told people we've robbed them of the end, right? We've robbed them of the idea, and then we've also robbed them of the belief and understanding that you're the author of this. You have to do the showing up every day and the choosing of the meaning. And so in every way, people are like emotionally handicapped. Maybe that's not politically correct to say. I'm not sure, but we're stifled. And this is how we're meeting men. We're meeting men and emotionally stuck in childhood, which is why, the whole idea of masterful men is to become unstuck, unshakable, and unstoppable, because we're finding men in those three states: stuck, shaken, and stopped. And I would attribute it to that they've lost their connection to story, their own story. They've lost their ability to be a meaning maker. They didn't lose it, but they're not living in it. And they've lost the idea that their life is going somewhere. And so if you restore some of these kind of basic elements, it gets men's story moving again. They get unstuck. They become resilient or unshakable, because when we have purpose, we're willing to cross that desert. And then they become unstoppable for the same reasons. Anything come up for you in that?
Yeah, it's interesting. The way that you describe it, it sounds like, to me, storytelling is almost like an inoculation against nihilism.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. I am fascinated by the idea that we have always told story. And I do believe that the further you get away from simplicity in story, the worse it gets. I was rucking yesterday with one of our members as we're doing our 77 strong challenge. And we were having this conversation about story and our part in it. Yeah, some of these concepts came up about meaning making and how long we've been telling stories. And in my story, I think both being a Westerner, but also grew up with an evangelical background that was really into systematic theology. And so I was talking with him yesterday, just saying, it's like we've taken simple stories and then we blow them up and make them uber complex. Like imagine if you took Star Wars, for example, and you developed like a bunch of books about like exactly what Pantone color is Yoda's skin. What color green is that, right? How tall are Yoda's ears or long? Like, who cares? But it's almost like we've had this fascination with pedantic details instead of the story plot. And I went through this, right, myself for a long time. I became fascinated with facts and details, but I started to miss the plot. And I did this in my life. I did this with relationships. I missed the simplicity of storytelling. And that's what was so powerful when John Eldridge back in those years was like kind of a catalyst for helping me see to reorient. Wait a minute, you're in a story. And when he did, I was like, I don't like my story very much. But now I know, well, that's a necessary part of a good plot. You're going to have your plot elements going to go that way. Anyway, say more about that.
So for me, I had a similar experience with that. For me, it was an interview I read with William Gibson, who is a name I expect more people will know shortly because his seminal work, Neuromancer, is about to get made into an Apple Plus show. But it was the book in the early 80s that really started the cyberpunk genre of sci-fi. There were stories prior to his, but his was the one that really kicked it off. And in this interview, he was talking about, he gets asked what every author gets asked, where do you get your ideas from? And his answer was what most authors will say, which is this world. And he described what was going on at the time in terms that made it sound sci-fi, even though he was just talking about headlines. But he said, now understand, I've just rattled off 6 different things. I can't write a book about that. It's too big. He says, your story has to be about one thing. He says, the world is too big to fit into any one book. Even if you're just going to take a slice of time, even a small one, there's just so much that's happening. So I think that one of the other important elements of viewing your own life as a story is kind of compartmentalizing some of these things. Your life is actually a tapestry of a bunch of different story threads. But, if someone was going to make a movie about your life, they're not going to take every aspect of your day, your month, whatever. They're going to focus on a particular theme that certain events all have in common. And that's going to be the story. There's nothing wrong with telling multiple stories about yourself. I hope that you have a rich enough existence that it will actually support that. But there is no need to try to make disparate elements of your life somehow make sense with one another. It's all just, the collection of stories that is you. So in order to make the exercise work, you need to identify those thematic elements that mean something to you and make the stories about each of those things.
I would say there's a multi-dimensionality to this, meaning, and I think that's what I hear you saying, whether we use the 3-act structure or the hero's journey, what I've noticed in my own life is there are some stories where I've already been through the 3 acts, right? There's others that I'm in the 2nd act. There's other I'm in the 1st act. And so it might be that in a man's life, you've got your romantic relationship, you've got your relationship with yourself, you've got your relationship with maybe something like wealth or career, mission, purpose, with relationships with other men. Like these, what I have found in my 50 years is they're all like independent plot lines, meaning that they're all somewhere in the story, right? And maybe that, you could look at a human life as like a story of stories, and they all have their own pace. They all have their own themes. They all have their own setting. They own their own dramatic tension. And this has really helped me a lot because it's also freed me from the belief that there is a there that I'm headed towards, right? Other than the grave, meaning, I might be really, really far along in my plot in one area of life, but I might be just getting started at another. And it's helped me appreciate, like even visually understanding that, that your life might be on one big hero's journey, for example. But then within that are all these like little, like, you're constantly going through the hero's journey or the 3 acts in these areas. And
you could look at it like
really
a
helpful.
big series. It's like 60 books, and each one of those books, though, is going to have a complete story. It's going to have the climax, the midpoint, the dark moment, the everything. But then there's the sort of meta narrative of the continuity between, volume 1 and volume 60. So just because there is a story that sees its way to completion doesn't mean that your story has seen its way to completion. It's just this bit of it along the way. The thing that really kind of struck me when I was trying to find a way to apply this to my life was, the big difference between literally being an author and authoring your own life is I, as an author, can absolutely control every single thing that happens in my story. Not only can I control the choices that my main character makes, but I can control the way other people react to it. I can control the weather. I can control random fate. If an asteroid hits the planet, and that's this, whatever, it is all mine. When we're authoring our own story, we don't get to do any of that. We get to make our own choices, and what other people's reactions are, completely out of our hands. Random fate, completely out of our hands. It's just what we do and how we see it. And so I can't plot forward. Me seeing a story unfolding in my life, I have found is mostly through retrospect. I can look at what has already happened and I can place it within that framework in order to derive meaning. But it doesn't, aside from maybe helping to inform a decision that I have, it doesn't forecast anything because that's out of my hands.
This is interesting. And I wonder if we could talk about this in relation to a concept that comes up for me a lot. You know about the 30-day Awakened Purposeful Man Challenge in our community, which is 30-day process of helping a man kind of find his story and find himself in his story, because most men actually, even with romantic problems aside, what they're most after is their sense of mission, purpose, and like, why am I here? Right. This is like the thing that bugs more men than their romantic partners. And as soon as their romantic challenges are addressed, this is generally the question that's even more urgent for them. And so that course, talks about this at a much deeper level. But one of the things I have in there is a lesson about you're the author of your life. And boy, does that make some people mad, especially people from certain religious backgrounds. And what I like about what you just described is look, being the author of your story does not mean that you're choosing, like you're plotting the future. And I'm not suggesting that either, but a lot of people who come from, I'll use an evangelical Christian background, for example, they're familiar with a term in the scriptures that Jesus is the author of life. And then they see me say, you're the author of your life. They immediately, like heretic, false teacher, because they're not understanding. I'm not suggesting you're the author of capital L, all of life, which is what that title in the scriptures would be, but that we have this unique place as humans in that we get to respond to the circumstances like as it unfolds. And so what I'm saying, and I want to know how you feel about this and how it ties into these themes, is that I can't create the plot. Like I can't control what the weather does or some circumstance that maybe enters my life. And I actually like this power better because I can actually choose the meaning I'm going to make. So it's like, circumstances happen and maybe I can just write a sentence and then the hero did X, Y, Z, or then the hero chose this, or then he thought that. Like, that's what I meant by being the author. I'm the author of what's happening inside the hero in the story. And this was a huge turning point for me coming from some of these, I would call them like fixed mindsets. And the way I grew up in the evangelical tradition really set me up into this, like everything is happening to me. I have no choice, no agency. And so my plot was very reactive because I didn't think I had any part of it. Right. And started to see some of these concepts like, well, no, I do have a role to play here. I get to choose things like you did with Bowder. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit, this nuance of understanding things like your specific role in your story.
Yeah, so that was a realization that had come to me when I was recontextualizing recent life events, and starting that story with Baldur's death. Prior to that, I had been saying, for example, I can't handle this. This is too much. I can't do it. And I remember shortly around starting to see that story, I was out on a walk and I just very reflexively, I started to get this very uncomfortable feeling within myself. And that would usually bring out, I can't do this. And I started to say it and I stopped because I was thinking about myself as if this was a movie, right? What if this was a drama and all of this stuff was the things that was happening to the main character? What would make a good story at that point? Would I want to see him just, go continue to abuse alcohol and weep on the floor? Or, would I want to at some point see some turning point with that?
Yeah.
And I realized, all right, well, if I am going to be a worthy protagonist in my own life, it means two things. One, I cannot continue to do the self-pity, self-soothing that I had been doing because I wouldn't want to watch someone else do it. It would make me uncomfortable. And I'd start to divest from that person because I just wouldn't feel like they're trying for themselves. So what am I going to stick around for? And that wound up changing what I said. I caught myself and I said, I don't want to do this. This is difficult. This is really unpleasant. I'm very unhappy to be in this situation. I don't want to do this, but I'm going to because I have to.
Could you talk about the role that agency and ownership have played in this? Because, I mean, you're sort of talking about them, but I want to maybe underscore it a little bit, or let's make this text bold, because
absolutely,
you had a turning point. And if we looked at it from a plot, it was a really important plot point where,
yes,
you had a shift, and these kind of shifts are like, they make or break the plot. So yeah, talk about that a little bit.
If you are going to be the main character in your own story, you absolutely need to have agency. You need to take agency. The term, if you're going to not use the term hero, the term is protagonist. Protagonist. You are going to be proactive. It is not a passive role. The protagonist is the one who drives the story. So that means you need to consciously make decisions. You need to consciously take action. It doesn't mean that you succeed at everything, but it doesn't mean that you lie down and die. Let me say real quickly, there will be times when that happens. The protagonist gets beaten to his knees. We already talked about that. He will fail multiple times in Act 2, in the gateway to Act 3, in the dark moment. He's absolutely beaten up and needs to take a knee. So it's not like you never get permission to hurt and to reel. That's perfectly fine. It's human. That's why it's baked into this structure that has survived for thousands of years across multiple civilizations. So it's okay.
It's also why we don't shame men in our community when they're having those take a knee moments, but actually you have to honor it as a sacred part of the process for all of us, that to show up in a man's low moment and witness it without needing to fix it, which it takes a very certain kind of space to be able to do that. But it does help. Anyway, keep going.
The difference between a tragic figure and a protagonist is that the protagonist will at some point get up and will push forward, will move the story forward. It doesn't end with that. That's not where we fade to black and roll the credits. It's not a lifestyle. It's a moment. Maybe it's a slightly longer moment. You are allowed to stay there for a bit. It's a hard hit. Yeah, if you are going to see yourself as the protagonist of a story, I think everybody has consumed enough media in various formats, be it print or video or whatever. At this point, we all fundamentally know at some point when we are no longer acting like the hero in our own story, and when we are now shifting over into victim.
You're provoking me here in a good way. By and large, I'd say almost with no exception, I'm meeting men when they're at this spot. And I would say a theme I see is actually that they've all stopped being the protagonist. And they're at this fork in the road where they could choose to be the protagonist. And really the dramatic tension of the plot is that they could also be, I don't know what the more technical term is, but they're also being invited to take the path of being a villain. Or maybe that's to become the antagonist. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. So what's really interesting is there's a relatively small amount of people that are willing to choose the protagonist role. And so one of the things I've seen in 6 or 7 years of this now is there's a absolute theme. There's always passivity. Now, a man, he'll get upset if he hears me saying that, because he's like, I'm not passive, and he'll tell me about all of his external achievements. But again, most men we're going to meet, it's going to be in a relationship crisis. And if we sit with him and he's willing to see himself, he has become passive about some pretty core plot lines in his story, definitely in his relationship, because he started to look at somebody else is creating this part of my life. And so kind of a big dramatic moment talking to a lot of men is to help them see you're here because it's time to be the protagonist in this story. And there's a railing, sometimes even venomous and angry response. All you got to do is look at the comments from a lot of people to our stuff, and you'll see some people hate this, right? And they have a very her, if she would just, right? It's all external. She's got to fix this plot. What about her not realizing she has her own plot, right? And you can't stall your plot because of somebody else's plot. And this is exactly what gets people into relationship trouble is you have lost your plot. You've made your plot about somebody else, which doesn't work in any story. And a supporting cast member has become the thing in your life. And for anybody listening, I would just say, if you lose the plot in your story, the woman in your life will move away from you. This is a really hard truth for a lot of men to understand, but it's very reliable. If you lose the plot or you make her the plot, she's going to move away from you. This is and this is going to piss people off to say this, but that in the anxious attachment kind of deal with a distancer or an avoidant, that's what's going on. When the man regains his plot 8.5 times out of 10, it fixes it. Sexless marriage, same thing. It's a man who's lost his plot. If you find a man who's angry and he's considering divorce, he's lost his plot. And a way to know you've lost your plot is that all of your thought energy and your emotional energy is directed at somebody else. Like that your thoughts are about other people. Anyway, I wanted to bring this out to kind of bring it back to what we do, because this idea of story can be really useful in understanding, how this works. Anything come up for you and me saying that related to what we're talking about?
100%. I think that I know I can speak from my own experience when I had become passive in my relationship, very external focused. And if I were to look at my situation like a story, it would seem off, because all of a sudden I, as the protagonist, am sitting here just waiting for somebody else to do something. And there's nobody who would look at that and say that that's the story I want to read. That's the story. That's the movie I want to watch.
Right.
That's the hero that I want to root for. But that might be a good moment for that kind of story, so that we're waiting then for the protagonist to have that light bulb moment and say, wait a minute, I've got to start taking some action here, and then do that. And so the constantly reframing circumstances as a story and imagining yourself as the protagonist within that. This is why I was saying, not only does it prevent you from being a victim, but it requires you to take agency.
Right.
It does not guarantee you a good outcome. It doesn't guarantee you pain-free or happiness or anything. Like long term, I think it will, just because if you own your own life, you're going to go in a better direction. But just viewing it as a story isn't going to say, like, I don't know, for example, that my marriage would have
Right.
would have been saved had I looked at it differently. But I would have gone through that in a better way.
Yeah, but nobody gets that. This is another thing we talk about a lot. There is no such thing as certainty for the future, other than what you can decide now you're going to be within yourself in the future. This is the beautiful thing about it, because the ego, the insecure, version of us, it's trying to control the uncontrollable. It's trying to manipulate, these circumstances in our story that we don't have any control over. And that's how you get a tragedy. But there is no path where you get to specify that it's never going to be painful. It's never going to have loss. It's never going to have adversity. And why would you want that?
Right. Again, like that's not a story I'd want to read.
But here's where confidence comes from. When you can say to yourself, well, I'm going to make a commitment to myself to keep turning this into a protagonist tale instead of an antagonist tale. I can be confident that no matter what happens to me 5 years from now, 5 days from now, 5 minutes from now, I'm going to keep realigning to this idea that, okay, I'm going to make this serve my plot, right? This is what agency and ownership give you, this capacity to keep choosing how you want to frame the things in your life that are not in your control. And that reorients you to your circumstances, and it allows you to stop suffering, because you're like you said earlier, you're not a victim anymore. You're a protagonist. And that seems to be the point. I find this to be tremendously useful. I would rather have a superpower of turning every single thing that could happen to me into a into a positive than to have a life where all my external circumstances were positive. Like, which one is more glorious to live in? Right? Like, imagine a superhero that no matter what you threw at them, they are able to convert it, and it built them up and their story up instead of actually being able to impact them. You'd be like, that's awesome. I want that. Right. And we do have this capacity. We have the ability to turn a woman's, I think I want a divorce, or I'm seeing someone else. I mean, we witness a lot of men have these pretty awful things, and we get to see all the different ways they turn out. And some men, they spiral into the antagonist. They turn very dark, very angry. They turn to villains, and then they end up hating the person that they loved, and they hate their life. They hate their plot. They're stuck. But then other ones will say, like, this isn't how I want the story to go. And they're not focused on the circumstances. They're focused on, like, okay, who do I want to be in response to getting this really terrible news? And it's really neat to watch. But it's also sobering because when you see, like, you know what, it's all up to you and the choices you want to make. It's really sad to watch some people not make those choices. That's the hardest part, I think, of, for me anyway, with what I do, is if some people won't make that choice.
I think you said something really important, though, and that is that when we're talking about taking storytelling and applying it to our lives, we talk about plot a lot, but we're talking more about character, because we don't get to plot we don't get to plot our life, right? When I was confronted with my fiance leaving me and seeing somebody else, I didn't have any control over whether she would come back to me or not. My story had to be about who I was. The story can't be ultimately about doing. It has to be first about being. And then the actions that we take are simply congruent with the self we decide to be. And the story is simply a manifestation of us living in accordance with that person. I had no control over what she was going to do. But who I was going to be in the face of that, and who I was going to be in the face of her ultimate decision, was the only thing that I could make that story about.
Well, I love this. Is there any kind of technical parallel to the idea of a story whose character was determined by the plot? Because what I hear you saying is, like, if your character is determined by your plot, your story might not be so good. At least negatively so.
Yeah, I would point to pretty much any B action movie. You know, the character is never tested in any way but external. They don't have value system isn't challenged. They themselves don't go through any particular personal transformation. In fact, I'll point out a movie I really like, which is Taken. I think most people would have seen that by now. I think it's a fun movie, but Liam Neeson's character, first of all, I don't even remember what his name is. I just remember it's Liam Neeson. That tells you how impactful that his character was to me. But Liam Neeson's character is a particular guy at the beginning of the movie, and he is the exact same guy at the end of the movie. He has not gone through any personal transformation whatsoever. His circumstances were the entire film.
Let's talk about one that's the opposite of that. It's one of my favorite examples of a film where I think the character goes through significant transformation. 3:10 to Yuma.
Love that movie.
Now, I don't have his name memorized, but that's more of a problem with Sven than the storytelling. But I actually thought about putting this in one of our courses, and I still may add it to the Connected Intimate Man course, because I think it's this great picture of a transformation of a man who is in that kind of weak, collapsing energy, who is living a reactive plot. He's actually living like a lot of traditional nice guys. His wife has no respect for him, and he thinks it's because of his bum leg, right? But it's not. It's about, like, who he's become within his character, which is really about submitting to fear and certainty instead of, like, moving past that. What else do you see in 3:10 to Yuma? Because I think this is such a brilliant movie on so many levels, but great picture of a guy finding his character.
And
Chris,
Christian
two
Bale,
guys, actually. Two guys.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, because the other transformation you see is, and now I can't remember his name either, but that's because I saw the movie years and years ago, but it was, now I can't even remember the actor's name. Russell Crowe's character goes through a rather dramatic transformation in that film too.
Yeah,
And
he's Ben Wade, and Christian Bale is Dan Evans.
those are kind of generic names. I think
Okay. Yeah.
we can be forgiven for not remembering that. But yeah, I mean, the two of them affect each other in some very deep ways, and they are absolutely transformed by the crucible of the experience that they share together.
Yeah.
Um, one of my favorite, since we're talking about Westerns, it's kind of a tragedy, but it's a really interesting character study, is Unforgiven, where you hear about Eddie Money, Clint Eastwood's character, being this just wretched criminal, and everyone is scared to death of him. And he's this bumbling old man who can't get his, pigs separated to get the ones who are sick away from the ones who are, he has to resort to using a shotgun because he can't hit anything anymore. But over time, he's tested again and again and again. And you see him make decisions to regain some of this strength he used to have. It's just that his problem is that the strength he had, that it becomes the strength that is necessary to do what he has to do, is all within a context that he would have preferred to have left behind. And he never figures out how to separate those two, how to be the man he needs to be while maintaining the virtue that he has gained by the beginning of the film. So it's not necessarily a tragedy, and there is a definite transformation there. It's just that the way that particular story does it is it's not heroic, but it could have been.
Are you saying because he only knows how to be like to pull from certain parts of who he wants to be in kind of a dark way?
I was going to say, if you want to put it into King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, these are, he only knows how to draw on the shadows.
Yeah, that's interesting because I run into this a lot helping guys that are facing divorce, because oftentimes they don't know their core being. They only know their shadows also. So it is tragic to watch, because their divorces they generally turn pretty high conflict, because they don't know how to navigate a divorce process as a hero. And so they actually see it as virtuous to shut their heart down and become cold and callous, because they don't know how to be okay. They don't know how to be resilient. They don't know how to be unshakable. And they really believe they're being strong. And this is the tragedy of it, because they're just being scared. And they do this very thing. Like they rely on these shadows to try to navigate them through probably life's hardest circumstance, believing it's going to be the way to not have to feel the deep, hard stuff that just sucks. And it produces the most collateral damage. I would actually say that's what Anakin Skywalker's character did as well. He didn't know how to transform his pain. That's really true for all villains. And maybe that's why I like 3:10 to Yuma, because you have a villain who's actually connecting with his core being a little bit. He's discovering his heart. He's seeing how he's been wounded in that space, and he's letting himself soften in good and healthy ways. Right. Which is why I like that, because that movie is a great example of basically both poles of the shadows of King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Meaning Christian Bale's character is on the collapsing side. He would be like the masochist and the innocent one. And if you're familiar with these terms, the weakling prince, he's got all of that going on. And Ben Wade's character is the opposite, right? And so what's cool by the end, when they're kind of going through the gunfight across town to get onto the train, it's actually neat because they're in a transformation in that moment. From a time they're up in this kind of hotel perch waiting for the train, you're seeing them go across town, but you're also seeing them come into like kind of their character a little bit, right? Which is, again, this is the beautiful thing about stories, is like that's a great picture of transformation. Whereas like the Anakin story, maybe Unforgiven, you're seeing somebody actually go further into the antagonist. They're becoming darkness. They're becoming a villain. And it doesn't mean that that's over until we take our last breath. But yeah, story can be a really powerful mechanism to talk about these things and to understand One of the things I like to have men do is ask them while they're going through this to, to start noticing what stories are getting your attention. Like what films just are making you like get that kind of choking feeling in your throat, or like you got to hold something back. Because oftentimes this is a way to start connecting with a part of us that might not have words sometimes, to see how the stories are impacting you.
I agree, because I think at our core, we understand what a heroic character would do in most circumstances. I think it's just that, especially when we're in a period of emotional strife, this is something of an academic exercise, and it's not where we're going to go to first when we're in a tremendous amount of pain.
You mean in our conversation? Yeah.
Right. So I know I sure as hell was not thinking of my life as a narrative when my wife was leaving me. That's just not where I was. I was desperate to keep her, and that's all I had room in my head for. But if I had looked at it from the outside as a story, I would have seen that the actions I was taking were not the things that I would want to see a heroic character take.
Like what? Tell us some of the actions that you were taking, even leading up to this.
So begging, pleading, drinking,
numbing,
yeah, punishing, generally acting like a wounded child, like a kid who was having a temper tantrum.
Do you think it's fair to say that that's exactly what was going on?
If
this is about an emotional maturity transformation,
100%. It was a young kid who was being jilted and didn't get the thing that he wanted, and so was having a temper tantrum.
Okay, and so you found yourself in a new season of life where those immature ways just don't work anymore.
It's not who I want to be. In fact, I would say like that's not even who I am. There was certainly a part of me that was, but my climb out of my black moment involved growing up, and so that child portion of me will always be there, but that's not the core me anymore.
Yeah. This is what I think maturity is all about, and one of the complex things is talking about in a way that doesn't judge the past, because we don't judge our 8-year-old selves for not being able to split a cord of wood or whatever, right? We recognize that life is about maturing, and it's just part of a natural cycle. So there's a natural cycle that happens emotionally, and the transitions through those cycles can be really painful experiences where you're kind of recognizing, this doesn't feel good anymore. Like maybe pouting worked when I was 6, but when I'm 36 and the woman in my life is again too busy to pay attention to me. I hear these kinds of things a lot, and I felt them too when I was that age. It's easy to go back to those places, the pouting, but that doesn't work for us, right? And this is the invitation. It's an invitation to grow, and not fun.
No, but I think that's the important thing. That's the hard sell of this entire process, right? It's not fun. I cannot give you something that's going to make this all better right now. And that's the hard thing to, for me anyway, was to reconcile when I had never experienced anything more intense than the emotional pain of collapsing relationships. Any physical thing I'd gone through, broken bones, whatever else, it just didn't hurt as bad or as long as emotional pain did.
Mm-hmm.
If someone was coming along saying, hey, you can get her back in 21 days, hell yes, I'll do that right now. And like you said, I wasn't lazy. I was going to do all of that work. But if you were instead going to say, well, all right, give me 6 to 12 months, it's going to feel really uncomfortable at the best of times. And in the meantime, like this pain you're in now, it's going to be a slow fade, but you're just going to have to learn to sit with it for months at a time while you heal. But you'll be in a much better place at the end of it.
Well,
what do you think?
During too, because the community, it's not, everybody has their own experience with these things. Yeah, this is a challenge, which is why we're not a community of thousands of people, because that's a hard sell. Well, one of our members said one time to me in a call, he's like, the problem is this is something everybody needs, but nobody wants. And I kind of chuckled, right? He's like, it's like a gym for your soul, but he's like, I don't know anybody that knows they need it. but now that I've done this, I know it was essential. And people say afterwards, most important thing I've ever done. Right. I'm not talking about working with me. I'm talking about just the journey into emotional maturity. But yeah, how do you even begin, letting people know that? Unfortunately, it comes from conflict that's so painful that you kind of run out of options.
So to bring it back to story one more time, we were talking about in the beginning, you have your inciting incident. And I said that that's not necessarily the thing that kicks you into action. In the story cycle or the hero's journey, the inciting incident is often called the call to adventure. And in that structure, more often than not, the hero refuses it. And it's only when they hit that first pinch point where the door slams and you absolutely don't even have a decision to make anymore. You have no choice. You must go forward. So a lot of people will be presented with that catalyzing moment, that inciting incident or the call to adventure, but they will refuse it and try to stay where they are because the familiar, it's the hell versus the one you don't. Like you said, people need to be in that point of pain. They need to be in that place where it absolutely is so bad that there's just no choice but to take that step into the unknown.
I have a lot of people like you're talking about, and it's usually people who are what I would call the addicted lover. They're just desperate to get the woman in their life back. And so they sort of dance around at what we would call the threshold, which is this line between, the ordinary world that they've known and the call to adventure. And they'll stay there. And that too is hard to watch because, after you do this a couple hundred times, you start to know what's coming next. And you're like, this person they're going to experience something pretty uncomfortable soon. And it's usually something like finding out that she was with another man or something that feels like, oh no, I can't come back from this. And it's oftentimes not until a man has had that really hard blow that he really is taking his own journey seriously. But there are other men, and these are the most fun to work with because it's joyful earlier. Some men are motivated by beauty instead of pain. So like what incites them to cross over that threshold and accept the call to adventure is actually a deep longing for more. So they're not motivated by pain, but they're motivated by pleasure and desire. And of course, I try to help men connect with their desire so that they're going on that journey because of desire, not because of pain. But unfortunately, some are not going to go until it's very painful. Some never.
Like you were saying, some people don't realize they need it. I was one of those. I was the addicted lover, and I didn't think there was anything wrong until, I just kept finding myself in position after position, which was just getting worse with repetition. And I just didn't feel like this was a tenable position anymore. Something needed to change, and I needed to change it.
Well, I'm looking forward to having you to tell that whole story, your long form story, which we'll do soon. We'll get you in the queue. But anything else that you felt like it would be good to talk about story? Any points? What do we not talk about that we should have?
I think I want to maybe just, instead of bring up new stuff, just put an underline under a couple of things that were big aha moments for me. Is that story for me has been most useful in retrospect, in providing meaning for things that have already happened. It doesn't predict the future, but it does help me put everything in a frame where I am making the right decisions. And by right, I don't mean necessarily that everything works out for me, but that I am maintaining my own power, that I am acting with agency, and even with compassion. It's not selfish. Our hero should be compassionate and empathetic and all these other things. And oftentimes a hero, especially in the story cycle or the hero's journey, will be met with companions, some of whom are older and wiser, and their purpose is to help educate our hero in order to continue. So this is not a solitary thing, even if you are the protagonist of your own story. There are other characters who have important roles to play, and as a hero, we would hope they would be kind to them. But it's mostly a framing thing. It doesn't take away the pain. It just gives everything a purpose. And I have found, contrasting these two things, going through basically the same situation with and without it, it just makes it more bearable and keeps hope alive where it wouldn't. But it doesn't fix It did not fix all of my problems. It simply
Sure.
gave me the capacity to continue to work at them. And that has been what has been the biggest benefit that I have gotten towards looking at my life like story.
Yeah, I would say with the pain, it doesn't always take it away, but it does change the nature of it. And, we talk a lot in our community, and you and I also, about weight training as a great analogy for this. If you walked around feeling like it was leg day all the time, you would probably be going to seek medical help.
Yeah.
But because of what you understand the pain of leg day to mean, it changed your relationship with that pain. It doesn't take the pain of leg day away, but it becomes different. It serves a purpose in which you're willing to endure it, and you're not stuck by it because you see it as going somewhere. And this is, again, weight training actually is a great example of the power of story. It's a place where we engage purposeful discomfort, adversity, challenge, labor. But because we tell ourselves a story about why, we keep showing up to do it, right? But again, if you took all that out, you wouldn't. And I would say that's what makes people quit weight training, is that they lose the plot, or the character part is something they're not willing to play. So yeah, it doesn't take away pain, but I don't think pain personally or discomfort is something to avoid. I think that's a natural part of our biology, but if we all did that, we would be living in that movie. What's that movie with Luke Wilson? Is it Idiocracy?
Yes. I thought you were going to say, I think was it Wall-E? It was an animated film in which it was a futuristic film. Everyone was living a life of comfort, and they lived in these lounge chairs that levitated because they'd all gotten so fat that they couldn't walk anymore.
Yeah. Same concept. Yeah. Well, it's been great talking about this. We could probably have a lot more conversation about the concept of story. I appreciate you being involved, and I'm looking forward to hopefully reading your book. How long is it going to be?
You mean till it comes out? The pub date is now set at July 23rd.
Okay. And what, you want to tell us the title while we're at it so we can be on the lookout? Or do we violate anything by telling us that? You allowed to?
Not at all. It's called Demonis Ex Machina, and it's actually under a pseudonym. I write under the name Russell Anders.
Okay. So say it one more time, the title and the author's name.
Demonis Ex Machina. And the author is Russell Anders.
Well, Russell Anders, thank you for being here today. We'll get you back soon to tell your whole story. And we'll see you soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to the Masterful Man podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to break free from stuckness, build unshakable confidence, and lead your life with unstoppable purpose, I invite you to take the next step. Join a community of men who are committed to growth, challenge, and real transformation. Learn more at www.masterful.men, because the life you want starts with the man you choose to become.